Has kicked off in Johannesburg. It's the 10th involving the heads of state of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, and the second time the summit is being hosted in this country. It's the first meeting since the US administration launched a push to rebalance trade it deemed unfair. Some analysts believe that US President Donald Trump's trade wars may give fresh impetus to this BRICS grouping. Now, of course, China has a strong presence in Africa, and since its exports to the United States are being curbed, it may be looking for fresh new markets. And this week as well, the Chinese President Xi Jinping pledging to invest that nearly $15 billion. Let's analyze day one. We're joined by Xhanti Payi, economist and founder of Nascence Advisory. Thank you for being with us.
Happy to be here.
Do you think that the trade wars could make this grouping more relevant?
I think it does. I think, there was a time, when this grouping was founded where, remember, it was a time when, Europe was struggling quite immensely. And I guess all of the West was struggling economically. And this grouping became even more relevant, right? Because we were saying, well, instead of actually always having been tied up to Europe in all our fortunes, let's look at each other and see what we can do. And I guess now it's even more impetus, especially because I guess it's a bit more hostile. But I think also, of course, there's troubles in Europe, Brexit, still some confusion over there. So I guess this grouping finds itself at a better time if, of course, they can agree with each other on how to do this.
I guess the one tangible thing is the bank. So that's kind of a different model to the IMF, say. Is it developing into that?
Well, I guess in some ways, but I think we're
still... So the West not always lending money, basically.
Exactly. And, coming together. But again, there has been the ugliness that's read its face in terms of where it was to be settled. And, there was that big debate around that, who has more the power, who actually is going to have the bank settled. And, of course, it ended up in China. And that didn't leave everybody very happy. And so I guess in some ways, we were always going to have this kind of competition and this kind of, difficulties and tensions. I think the important thing is to see actually if there is a real difference in terms of how these deals are done and whether they are more favorable, whether or not actually the terms are different. And that's really still to be seen. I think the Eskom example is probably one good example to take us forward in terms of the conditions that are there. I think these conditions have been agreed by everybody else in terms of, making sure that, we reach to our agreements around climate change rather than being imposed by somebody else. I guess that is a positive thing. But by and large, though, you still have, the same kinds of requirements.
Well, when it comes to Eskom, say, should we as taxpayers be happy that the Development Bank or the China Bank is giving Eskom money? Some would say that means there's perhaps less scrutiny, perhaps more scope for corruption, because the money is not coming from our coffers, certainly directly.
No, I think certainly not. The Chinese are not here, for free for all. These are things that they are concerned about, right? They are going to want to make sure that Eskom is healthy. They're going to want to make sure that, the right kinds of conditions exist.
Are you saying the Chinese care about corruption?
I think it's not so much that they care about corruption, but nobody wants to lose money.
They care about efficiency.
Absolutely. They don't want to lose their money. They want to make sure that their money, comes back. And so even if they may not care about their own corruption, they certainly do care about ours because they're not here to lose their money. And I think you can see it even in the way in which actually we've heard that this has actually been backed up with a government guarantee. So they've actually secured themselves quite clearly. And that sometimes actually is quite interesting. You would have thought that would not be needed in such a friendly, environment that we operate in.
So the idea is that perhaps China will be looking for new markets or deeper connections in Africa because its exports aren't going to the US as they were. But what do we get? We can't send steel or aluminium to China where we're blocked in the US. What do we get out of this?
Look, one of the things that has been discussed is actually this idea of actually helping Africa industrialize. Because as we say, it's no longer enough that we sell, just, minerals in their raw form. We want to sell more complex products to the Chinese. And the Chinese have committed to open their markets. Now, this has been quite a huge struggle over a period of time to allow, opening up their markets so freely and so openly. Of course, there are other things, in terms of how competitive we can be. remember in South Africa we've got things like minimum wages, worker rights, democratic movements, and all of these things that actually are not so well entrenched in China. And that actually will, sort of tilt competition towards China, if we think about it. And so even as we try to industrialize so that we can actually compete, we still have to compete with China with their products. So how do we actually do that is going to be an interesting thing. And I think these are very honest discussions that we have to have. It's all nice to talk about, well, we are all friends and we're all in the same grouping. But when it comes to the push, we're going to still be, making sure that we are competing and that we are able to actually profit from this relationship.
And when it comes to trade, does the BRICS grouping make any difference? Some would say, well, the money would go where money could be made anyway. Is there any benefit to working under this umbrella?
And this is exactly the thing that we have to iron out. I think one of the things that they've said is that, at least we can work out, whereas before you didn't have a situation in which actually there's a bank that makes sure that we are all actually advancing in terms of technology, that there's a bank that is going to allow for the creation of industry, for creation of infrastructure to help assist that trade. So that's a positive thing. But going forward, under what terms then do we actually move forward in that? Because it's one thing to have a bank that allows us to create factories, but are those factories actually allowing us to actually export to each other in a way that actually, I suppose, brings about this balance in trade that we want?
So you've touched on what the Chinese President Xi Jinping said, and he was talking about leapfrogging in terms of development, and we know Africa may be missing out on some industrialization. You can go to the next level and still become technological. Talking about innovation, maybe that's where we could benefit. Could there be sharing of technology, of ideas?
Look, I think the Chinese have certainly pushed forward this idea of sharing of knowledge, of ideas, and certainly one of the things that they are doing is to, take off a lot of our young people, to go and study in China, to share in exchange programs, to be able to actually say, look, we know a lot, we've advanced quite a bit in terms of, of knowledge systems, and we are very happy to share that with you. And then that's one part, because of course, we don't want only a normal workforce, we want a skilled workforce. And that's what they've also been doing in trying to skill up their workforce. So we can benefit from that. And I think that's a plus. In terms of the technologies, we've got to be very clear about what kinds of technologies actually we are accepting, because every country is at a different stage of development. There is no point in leapfrogging technologies that have no use to our people. Many of whom, of course, have lack of education, poor in rural areas. That there are technologies that they can use, but there are technologies that are not particularly useful. And that's something that we've got to be very careful about.
Very quickly then, the visa-free, that'll help business, but is that viable? No visas within the BRICS if we're not even doing that in Africa?
That's true. I think also South Africans are not particularly people who travel a lot. We have access to many countries actually where we can go in without visas, but we don't tend to because we're still quite reserved. But a lot of people do tend to come to us and to use that benefit. And so perhaps we're going to have to also educate our people to take advantage of all these advances, or these opportunities. And I think that's also another big thing that we've got to do, is that they're not all pie in the sky, but actually these things that people can use, that we can convert into real opportunities in real time that people can actually take advantage of.
Thank you for your time tonight. That was Xhanti Payi from Nascence Advisory. All right, we take a short break. We'll be back.